a Senior Research Associate at the Nautilus Institute, Honorary Fellow, Professor at Melbourne University, and a long-time analyst and scrutineer of policy issues that this Commission is considering. So we welcome the opportunity to hear from you today. Thanks, Richard.
Peter, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and the kind introduction. And I'll begin by simply acknowledging we're on Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin people and the sovereignty has never been ceded. That should be a matter of elementary politeness at this stage in our history of this country, but clearly it's not. And I think that matter is in fact salient to the foreign policy and defence policy issues that we are considering today. I'm principally going to be talking about Pillar 1 of AUKUS, but I'll also say something briefly at the end about Pillar 2. I'll be brief all the way through. I'll probably be a little more polite than Gareth or Tillman, although I greatly appreciated, I only heard part of Gareth's comments and really enjoyed them. And particularly I want to support the last 5 minutes of Tillman's presentation apropos waste, and I'm happy to enlarge on that. I'm principally going to focus on the primacy of strategic policy, Australian strategic policy, and what I take to be its subordination to alliance politics and to American strategy. I think that's the core set of issues that are here on the matter of defence policy. Any weapon system, any deployment, acquisition, hosting of a strategic weapon system in particular, has to address two questions. Firstly, how does that platform or system meet the strategic requirements to which it's nominated to be the solution? And secondly, what are the strategic consequences that flow therefrom? I don't believe that we are in a position to say very much about the actual process there, but I'll come back to that. There are many other critically important issues, not least the travesty of governance operations, the trashing of cabinet responsibility, the lack of parliamentary accountability throughout the AUKUS process, to say nothing of the issues of budget, finance, economic consequences, environment, nuclear waste, and particularly security legislation that are flowing from that. All of these are important matters, but I won't say any more about them for the moment. Qua defence policy, those two questions are absolutely critical. And I think what has happened actually is essentially the subordination of those questions, especially in terms of public accountability, to what really amounts to an a-strategic policy, a policy which does not discuss in detail, with care, with balance, the requirements, the consequences, the fallout, and the alternatives to the policy which is being offered. On Pillar 1, on the question of attack submarines, there are a variety of roles attributed publicly by government to the need for these long-range, long stability, long sustainability capabilities. But they're usually in peripheral matters such as intelligence collection, special operations, or basically PR guff about protecting sea lanes from a trading nation, as if our adversaries were not trading nations also. Really, what really matters is the only two strategically rational roles that make sense in the current historical and particularly alliance context are firstly, a marginal role of a small number of Australian submarines, whatever their character, protecting US carrier task forces attempting to penetrate People's Republic of China defences, in particular coastal defences and out to the first island chain. In the past, that has not been an issue for the United States. They've been able to do it at will. That is no longer the case and will become increasingly less so. Secondly, a role, again marginal, of Australian attack submarines hunting together with American submarines and anti-submarine warfare assets, Chinese ballistic missile submarines. The point about the latter, of course, is that China has at present very few, and likely in the future reasonably few, ballistic missile submarines, which make up the only possibly survivable part of their nuclear deterrent force. In other words, it could survive an American first strike. Maybe, maybe not. But we are contributing very heavily to the possibility of not. And I would suggest that both sets of missions are, if not suicidal, at least deep, hugely risky, and in the long term in particular, if successful to any degree, could not but contribute to deep historical enmity towards Australia. I think we need to think about that. What's really important, I see, or the current context I see, is when I read the integrated investment planning documents recently published by the Albanese government and the related strategic reviews and defence reviews, I see an extraordinary emphasis on interoperability, which in the past was a relatively simple matter of do your radios communicate to each other, but now is interoperability for actual high-tempo combined warfighting operations and essentially combined forces operations. I think, in fact, that Pillar 1 is broken, the submarine one. You'll have many other experts on some of the matters I'm going to be talking about, speaking about this. But I'll just very quickly talk about them. Phase 3, the construction of AUKUS class submarines led by BAE in Britain and the Australian Submarine Corporation in Australia. It is highly implausible that we will receive anything like the stated requirements in anything like the time and anything like the budgetary frameworks. To be quite frank, the British submarine building industry is very close to dysfunctional, and you would be hard put to find a more major government in Europe dysfunctional politically at the moment. And that's a serious impediment. Secondly, so I don't really take that very seriously at the moment, although it has one important residue I'll come back to. Phase 2, which is the Australian Navy's acquisition of American Virginia-class attack submarines. Tillman's addressed part of those issues quite well. I'll say nothing about nuclear propulsion because I support what he said. What's really important is that requirement, that estimate of 3 to 5 Virginia-class submarines to be purchased from the early 2030s through to the 2040s before the fantasised AUKUS class comes on, is morphing very, very quickly. We now know very quickly that we're clear that Australia will not purchase a new nuclear-powered Virginia-class submarine, blocks 5, 6, 7, or possibly 8. That's not going to happen. We are going to be offered some second-hand. How many of the 3 to 5? We don't know. I think it's also clear, and the US Extraordinary Office of the Congressional Office of the Congressional Research Service, its division led by Ronald O'Rourke, made clear the other possibility very clearly being discussed in US command circles at the moment, that instead of RAN owned and commanded Virginia-class submarines, some of those 3 to 5 Virginia-class submarines to come to Australia will in fact be US Navy, US commanded submarines. And if you look at the submarine construction backlog and the specification of American strategic requirements for themselves, the reasons for that are pretty obvious. So we don't know, but it's certainly flawed. It's certainly going to be delegitimised to the extent we have US commanded US submarines home ported explicitly in Australia. Which brings me to phase 1, which is the most real and the most dangerous part of AUKUS Pillar 1. And this is the fact that Tillman has alluded to, in fact, Tillman has adumbrated quite well, that since 1991, and under Bush the Elder, all tactical nuclear weapons were removed from US Navy ships, surface ships, attack submarines, and naval aviation. A huge change, most welcome. There is no legal impediment to any administration changing that. It's simply a matter of presidential decision to do so. We know very clearly that the conventionally armed Virginia-class submarines, which are still being built, as Tillman again adumbrated quite well, the Trump administration, and in particular the current Congress, have mandated as a matter of law, as far as they're concerned, that the sea-launched cruise missile-nuclear which is designed especially for the Virginias, is to be delivered by not 2034, as was previously mentioned, but 2032. And the funding is being applied accordingly. The head of the Sandia National Nuclear Laboratory, the people who gave us most of our nuclear weapons on the American side, have said this is a matter of urgency for us and we are proceeding as quickly as possible and expect to meet that target. In other words, by 2032, of course there's slippages, of course there's movement, but by 2032, which by my count is about 2 normal elections away in Australia, this is something we have to face. And the extraordinarily important bottom line is that the Albanese government has refused on repeated occasions of questioning to face the fact that there is no policy or legal impediment to bringing nuclear weapons into Australia, as long as they are labelled transit or visit. I've got some arguments with some of the definitions that Tillman cited from a particular legal expert, but more or less I would agree with that. There is no impediment, and no submarine stays in its home port for very long, unless it's rather sick. In other words, we're not in the fly-in, fly-out territory of the B-52s coming into Tyndall, but we are in a situation where even today, in the last year, there have been 2 Virginia-class submarines coming to HMAS Stirling for what is called deep maintenance, and they've been there for a month at a time. In other words, when Submarine Rotational Force West begins formally at Stirling next year with up to 4 American Virginias and a maybe British attack submarine, but certainly the American ones, we will be effectively home porting American submarines. They may be legally based in their squadrons at Guam, Hawaii, but they'll be able to operate from Australia. And to repeat, there is no legal or policy impediment to them being nuclear armed. And that, it seems to me, to be a matter of extraordinary nuclear permissiveness that we should not be tolerating. I'll finish very quickly by commenting on Pillar 2. Most of Pillar 2 consists of evolutions of already existing bilateral matters that I won't go into, and I certainly won't say anything about quantum computing because I can barely spell it, let alone understand its physics. However, I do want to talk about one very real, already built, already very close to full operation, and that's the Deep Space Advanced Radar Capability Site at HMAS, about 2.5 kilometres south of the Northwest Cape. Communications facility and another 2 kilometres distant from the extraordinarily advanced American-built space surveillance telescope. Both the dark radar and the space surveillance telescope are aimed at what is called geosynchronous orbits of satellites. The ARC in particular, they all can reach the range of satellites positioned anywhere from the mid-Pacific all the way through to the edge of the western edge of the Indian Ocean. The reason Australia was chosen, as an American admiral put it recently, location, location, location. He really did say that. And that's the point. This is an American facility which will be considered joint by the Australian government, but which has the capacity to, at high volumes, at high speed, in an automated, artificial intelligence-informed way, and a really good artificial intelligence-informed way, detect, precisely locate, characterise and monitor the movements of adversary satellites. This is what you need for space warfare to be carried out. The data from the SST, the telescope, and from the dark radar will pass through what was called RAF Base Edinburgh, or it is RAF Base Edinburgh, but is now a particular part of the Australian Defence Space Force. But the data goes to and is controlled by Space Command. That's what it's there for. This iterates that pattern of strategic thinking, of ignoring the consequences, and most certainly not discussing the consequences of these matters with the Australian public. I welcome the inquiry as the first step in rectifying that. Thanks very much.
Leanne.
We've heard quite a bit about the problems with the increasing nuclear weapons or nuclear capability passing through Australia, and you've just touched on a bit of that in your submission. I'm wondering if you could turn your mind to the proposition quite often put by defence and government supporters of AUKUS that this is in fact a great deterrent, which is keeping us safe, not just bringing us, painting us as a target. Thanks.
First thing I would say, as somebody who has worked on and taught nuclear weapons for a long time at a fairly high level internationally, is that to talk about nuclear deterrence is utterly misleading. Nuclear deterrence would be a very good idea if it would work. But for all governments of major nuclear weapons power, their first consideration is not so much deterrence, but what happens when deterrence fails. And no government of a nuclear weapon state proceeds on the assumption it will fail and that they will be unable to do anything about it. That do something about it is called nuclear war fighting. All of the major intelligence facilities, I think that was alluded to briefly in Australia and by Gareth as well, certainly have a deterrence role, but that is a follow-on from their primary role in ensuring that if there is a nuclear war, nuclear weapons will be used in the way most appropriate to the combat requirements of the United States. In terms of AUKUS submarines, I actually have not seen any serious analysis of that from the Defence Department in terms of a precise connection to a deterrence role, other than at a very general role that if we should support the United States in its activities, global activities in support of nuclear deterrence. And that leaves open, of course, the question of, is that what the United States is actually doing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Richard, you're a bit of an expert. Firstly,
I know I'm in
do
trouble.
you have a view about whether it was the United Kingdom that started the AUKUS idea?
Anyone who claims to know anything about the inner workings of the leading liar of the Conservative Party at a certain time, I think is probably deluding themselves. I'm sorry to be facetious, but lying is actually really important at this level. And that applies to the Morrison government, as a certain other European President reminded us. I think that it is very, I would see, I'll preface it by saying the dark radar is listed as an AUKUS arrangement now, of course, 3 governments, the Anglosphere there, but of course it long precedes, the planning for it long precedes that. So there's that. On the question of the submarines, my reading of, again, who knows what the cognitively impaired president was thinking at a certain time, but amongst the United States planning, I have no doubt this was part of a fairly long, very carefully considered decision. And then I think you have the other 2 partners, leaders of those countries, were quite frankly opportunists who saw possibilities. In terms of Britain, well, who else is going to give a dying British shipbuilding industry a massive subsidy for the next 30 years?
On Australian money.
On Australian money, exactly.
Richard,
so I'm sorry, I can't give you a clear answer, but I think I know what the answer is.
I take the point. Annie Jacobson's book on nuclear war, I'm sure you've read. How accurate do you think that foretells the result of a failure of deterrence?
I haven't read all of it. I've certainly read part of it, and I've certainly read the parts that that relate most closely. I think what's really important about the Jacobs book is that she drew on very careful interviews and documentations from a great many people. And in particular, in this case, I think the huge revelation in a public sense was the work she cited from Lynn Eden in her remarkable study, The World on Fire, which indicated that highly bureaucratized, and I say that actually in a kindly way, and rational American long-range strategic planning of nuclear weapons use going back to the 1950s quite explicitly removed consideration of the thermal effects of fire. And that was it's hard, is the reason why. That problem was eventually solved, and Eden reports on that. And I'm thinking more of the Eden book, I guess. I can't read it without feeling absolutely sick. Leaving aside my concerns about war in general, other aspects of nuclear war, nuclear targeting of our country, the questions of the climate consequences of nuclear war, I guess that Ian summed it up, the world on fire, because it is all the work we have seen on wargaming, and I imagine you've participated yourself in some of it, serious wargaming in the United States, and my understanding in the old Soviet Union, it was rather similar, and probably in Russia, it becomes very implausible that limited nuclear war can be managed. I think that's the point.
That was my view, having read the book.
Yeah.
Thanks. From Carmen? We'll wait till that comes across. Richard, thank you very much. Have you had the opportunity, or do you know if anyone has had the opportunity to identify the funding sources, the appropriation, and any of the legal or regulatory oversights of the money that's gone through to DARC?
No, I have not. And I also would say the same thing about AUKUS Pillar 1 as an even larger thing. But at DARC, most of it has been paid for by the United States. It was originally a DARPA, Defence Advanced Research Projects agency contract to Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. They developed the first prototype of it at White Sands in New Mexico. It has been built by Northrop Grumman, and Northrop Grumman has the contract for the second one, which is in Wales. Basically, if you think of the geography of what America is concerned with, we are the primary one, location. Western Europe is a place for a second one, and maybe there'll be a third. So no, the figures I've seen about Australia, the Australian contribution, Chris and Nana have seen more, are rather rubbery about that. And in particular, precisely what is covered. We know, for example, that Australia paid some of the money for the transfer of the Space Surveillance Telescope, but that was minuscule compared to the costs of developing and building. These are extraordinary pieces of technology. I mean, DARC, for those of you who may not know, it consists of a set of 7 antennas about the width of this room, transmitting in synchronized, coordinated form to very powerful signals, 36,000 kilometres out, bouncing back another 36,000 kilometres to be received by another 17 coordinated antennas. The physics is really interesting. The technology is genuinely extraordinary. It would be absolutely absurd for us to say anything about its joint character other than the fact we have a few men and women at Edinburgh who will have access to the data at the same time as the Americans.
Okay, thank you for that. A question from Carmen Lawrence. I think this will probably...
Sorry, can I say one more?
Oh, yes, of course.
I didn't mention it. The question of auditing is just immensely important. And it seems to me that one of the things which strikes me is, despite the extraordinary work done by the Australian National Audit Office and the Auditor General, none of the key matters have come within its ambit. I don't understand precisely who gets to say what they're allowed to cover, but it is just extraordinary that we do not know about this.
Thank you for that. Carmen Lawrence asks, it would appear that the risks associated with effective home porting in WA are elevated by the possibility of subs being nuclear armed. Are you aware of any protocols to reduce risk, accident or other?
Given that this Australian government and its predecessors, or this Australian government refuses to use the word nuclear capable when these matters are under discussion at Senate estimates, and I'm including ministers, defence secretaries, Australian Defence Force chiefs and their lower ranked people, will basically do somersaults to make sure the word nuclear capable is not uttered in their presence, particularly by ministers. I don't think there is any reason to believe that ANSTO and other agencies have been commissioned for deep study of these matters. I very much doubt that we have any remnants of nuclear civil defence capability going back to which we at one time had a little of in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm not sure whether that's something we want to pursue, but at least it would admit that there is a problem. And I'm not aware of very serious study of this issue as a government priority. If I were the Mayor of Katherine, I'd want to know about the nuclear capable aircraft, which could be carrying nuclear weapons. I don't think they are actually, but there's nothing impeding that except a decision. And if I were involved if I lived in Perth, I'd certainly want to know what preparations we were making. I suspect one of the things I would clarify is I'm not sure that an attack on Stirling would necessarily be a nuclear weapons attack. If you consider the geography, that may not be necessary, but it might. It's an open matter.